Trevor Cook was our final speaker this morning. Trevor is one of the most respected consultants in New Zealand, and he's a former winner of the Landscroft Prize for Communication. He's been involved in some of the best initiatives that Beef and Lamb New Zealand has been involved in. He's a vet by trade, but we'll not hold that against him. He's moved away from the day-to-day practice to concentrate on consultancy, specialising in, among other things, nutrition management from grazing. Trevor, it's over to you.
Thank you. Good morning.
Just the arrows, bottom one, down one.
In that intro, certainly I am a veterinarian, and people find it very strange that the job that I have is almost exclusively about looking at whole farm productivity. And it began from a background of going to university to get an ag science degree, to go back home and dairy farm. And while I was at vet school, I got captured by the glamour of being a veterinarian, and it is a glamorous job. Well, at times it can be a glamorous job. And I got captured and did a veterinary degree, but I never lost that passion for farming. And even though I did 25 years of clinical work and putting my hand up cows' bums, my interest has always been in farming, and just having 60 acres that I farm isn't enough. And I now have the privilege of working with farming businesses all over New Zealand and working with them from a whole farm productivity point of view. And it gives me access to the best, because I find that only the good farmers are prepared to pay for advice, and it's the good farmers that are prepared to use advice. And I'm privileged that I have access to those people, and I learn as much from them as they think that they're learning from me. But I do live in a paradise, and talking to many people here, and the number of people that have been to New Zealand know about New Zealand, and I think there are a whole lot of similarities between what we do and even the landscapes. But I think the people and the farmers have a lot of similarities in the things that drive them and the passion that drives them. But we do live in a paradise, and I'm privileged to work with the farming businesses that I work with, but it's the places that I go that are particularly special. And it's the things that come with our farming systems that make it fun, and I think we're too easy. We are going to talk about money. We've talked about money all morning, and there's no question that is an essential component of sustainability. But the fun part of it is also vitally important. And as explained, we have sports which we disguise as work in terms of sharing. And we can grow beautiful pastures, and I get blown away with hearing about 16 or 17 tonne pasture production per hectare, because there's not a lot of places in New Zealand that will do that. And a picture there of one of my veterinarians. I'm part owner of a large veterinary practice. We have 48 veterinarians scattered here, there and everywhere, including Vietnam. And as a veterinarian, your job is very well defined. It's very much focused on animal health. And what I forever am trying to get across to our new graduates is that animal health is just a little cog in a whole production system, and we have to focus on profit. And so I'm not going to give you any light bulb moments today at all, I don't think, because I'm going to give you the most unsexy stuff. But it's the stuff that is about making money, and we have to focus on making money. And so the topic I got was increasing production from pasture or something like that. And I think that's it's a wrong message. That has to be increasing profit from pasture, and profit and production and profit aren't necessarily linked. And one of the things that I've learned, certainly in our farming systems, and very much in European farming systems, and I must admit I've had more look at French ones than UK ones, that there are a lot of production systems that are producing at very high levels that are making no money. So focusing on profitability has to be where we're at. And if we look at profit, what drives profit the world over, it is a very simple equation. It is the quantity of product that we sell, the value of that product that we sell, so the income side of it, but also It's about the cost of producing that product. A very simple equation, probably in any business that applies. And in our systems, in our pastoral grazing systems, where we're exposed to the elements of weather, of nature, where there's a certain amount of unpredictability, a feature of the top performers is the lack of variability in their outputs. Whereas farmers so easily blame the weather or whatever's going around them as to why they haven't got the outcomes that they planned for. The good farmers aren't as limited by those things that they can't control. So when we look at measuring the profit in our pastoral grazing systems, we have to always look at it on the basis of the area that we're farming. And I think we can easily lose track of that when we don't respect that the driver of our profit in pastoral grazing systems is the pasture that we grow. So therefore pounds per hectare, dollars per hectare, whatever. And it is production. It is largely production driven. But we can't assume that it's production driven unless we do the whole equation of looking at the cost of that production. And I was really pleased. Michael gave some figures, and he had exact figures on his cost of production, and that is such a vital figure, and it's a really a weakness in New Zealand farming systems, and I guess and also over here, in not having that information to truly know what it's costing us to produce whatever we're selling. Interesting, when we're looking at pastoral grazing systems, so looking at those systems that are based on pasture that we're grazing, one of the key drivers of profitability in those systems is the percentage of pasture that we utilise. And when we look at utilisation of pasture, a key factor that, just coming back to that utilisation, we've got two bits of information that are so convincing. When we look at the top 10% dairy farmers in New Zealand, the top performing in terms of profitability, it's not to do where they farm, it's not to do with the breeder cows, whether they've got crossbreeds or Holsteins. The thing that is common for those dairy farmers is that they all utilise over 85% of the pasture that they grow. When we look at the group of farmers that use FarmX is a computer program that I use a lot, that is used throughout New Zealand, particularly in sheep and beef systems, as a feed budget program, but also as a systems analysis program. The feature of the top performance is the close link between their supply and demand curves. What they grow, they utilise. So utilisation is probably an under-respected component of high performance in pastoral production systems. So it's about pasture allocations, having rotations, and rotational grazing is the only way to produce a lot of pasture and utilise it to its maximum. Respecting residuals, John talked about residuals. Farmers in New Zealand, and I sensed it here, farmers here, judge how well they're feeding their animals by the amount of pasture they put them into. How well you're feeding your animals is judged by how much pasture is left when they come out. It's not about what they go into, it's about what was there when they came out. Using residual dry matters to drive adequacy of feed is I think, a poorly understood concept, but it's an essential concept because that is what drives productivity. Of course, pasture quality. Rotational grazing is the key to producing high quality pasture. With high quality pasture, you get high utilisation. So coming back, is productivity related to profitability? In a lot of systems it is closely linked, and we've got to recognise that where market premiums are applied because of farmer supply or some other spec around the product that we're selling, there may be not quite that link. So how do we measure that? Measuring the kilograms of product produced per hectare is a very, very common KPI that I use as a way of simply comparing progress or measuring progress. How much product are we turning off this farm per hectare? Which is a consequence of production per head and per hectare. One that we talked about yesterday on the farm we're at is looking at sheep breeding systems. What is the measure of productivity in sheep breeding systems? There's one measure that drives the profitability in sheep breeding systems. It's the kilograms of lamb weaned per hectare. Lambing percentage is part of that, weaning weight is part of that, but equally stocking weight is part of that. Return on the feed consumed, so cents per kilogram driver. Chris talked about that as one of his key drivers, and in dairy systems you can do that as that driver, as the indicator of profitability. What's the return that you're getting on the feed that you produce and then is consumed? And gross margin per hectare. So when we look at gross margin per hectare, it's the KPI that I use most when I'm looking at farming systems, trying to benchmark them, and as a measure of productivities, because it is a direct measure of productivity in terms of a trading profit, but it takes off the costs that are most closely linked to that trading enterprise. And remembering that the attraction of pastoral grazing is that the feed is cheap. It's not easy to graze pasture. John told us a great story, but it's not easy to do that. Reese made it sound as if it was simple, but pastoral grazing is not simple. The attraction is that it's a cheap feed. I guess for New Zealand, the New Zealand beef farmers have access to premium markets, particularly in Asia and Western United States, because our beef is pastorally raised. So there is a premium advantage in some circumstances because they have that background. But pasture is cheap. But everybody gets excited about per head performance, and everybody came along today thinking they're going to hear something that will make their bulls, that layers grow their bulls at 2.3 kilos a day when they've only ever been able to do 1.5. And without question, per head performance is a driver of profit, but it's not. It's not the only driver of profit. And we can readily measure per head performance, probably easier than people think they can measure per hectare. But we do have to relate it back to that, to area that's being used to do that. So the simple equation, farmers in New Zealand, and I guess farmers here, will argue forever about genetics and whether this ram is better than that breeder ram, whether that bull is better than that breeder bull. Yet, in actual fact, the expression of those genetics is where you've got most influence, and in most farming systems is most important in driving the profit. Farmers argue forever about genetics and forget about what has to be done to expose those genetics. So there's no question that some genetics will grow better than others. When we look at our pastoral grazing systems, if we just don't offer them enough, they don't grow. So when we look at systems where animals aren't growing so well, the most common cause of animals not growing fast enough is they just do not offer enough. If we add pasture quality into that, pasture quality is the other key driver of individual animal performance. And if we're offering poor quality forage, no matter what it is, offering more won't compensate for having lower quality. So quantity and quality are key. So if we look at our grazing systems, it's the consumption of energy is the key limitation or the key driver of profitability. It is just purely energy. How much sugar are we feeding those animals in our pastures? People talk about whether they should be getting 14% protein or 22% protein or 26% protein. If we're in pastoral grazing systems, protein will never be the limitation to production. And when we're looking at pastures, there's a variety of other things that get in the road, and these are a real complication that have to be managed in pastoral grazing systems and are almost peculiar to pastoral grazing systems. So what is high quality pasture? John's already talked about it, but I'll just reinforce that, because while I was sitting there I was thinking there's a lot of the same messages coming out, and as you are presumably you're consenting adults, you need to hear things over and over again before you will take them on board and actually do something about them. So high quality pasture has a lot of green leaf. That is the driver. Green leaf is what contains the sugar, and there won't be the more of the non-sugar stuff that's in that pasture, the more it dilutes the ability of the animal to take in the good stuff. Ideally have a lot of clover, because we don't get a whole lot of variation in quality of clover. In fact, clover is the same quality the whole year through, whereas our grasses have a lot of variation in quality throughout the year. Ideally, our herbage will be young. That is, it grew last month, not last year. It has a big impact on the quality of that pasture. And one of the things that many up here are blessed with, I guess, is that temperatures tend to be a bit lower. Quality pastures are easier to grow in cooler temperatures. And something that we may not realise, although instinctively you see the outcomes of doing it, if we want to offer animals the best quality pasture available, they have to have choice. So if animals, cattle or sheep, go into a pasture and in 24 hours they will select a diet that's 1.5 MB higher than the diet that we'd offer them. So if we're looking to absolutely maximise access to quality pasture, they have to have choice. Just a simple table showing the benefits of high quality pasture. In this case we're looking at the return of putting 50 kilos live weight onto a bull, and the impact of quality of pasture means that the harvest feed is being consumed going into maintenance, so that the return just driven by the intakes are the same, just driven by quality, increases profitability. Quality in our pastoral systems is the key to productivity. It is probably the most difficult aspect of it that we have to manage. I put this up as data that came out from beef and lamb. We have a lot of access to data from our farming systems. Vanuatu is the area that I come from, and it's simply looking at the different income on the same type of country between the top performers and the average and the ones further down. And when you burrow down into what these guys here are doing compared to those guys or those guys, it's not the breed of cattle that they've got. It's not the farming system that they've got. The feature of these guys is that what they do well. We can argue forever about whether this enterprise is better than that enterprise or whatever. Whatever we've got, doing it, making it perform well is what will drive profit. And when we look at that, it is feed. Nutrition. So if we are going to produce more from pasture, we have to grow enough, and it has to be high quality. So the things that John was talking about, I think, are absolutely essential if we're going to have control over growing lots of pasture and growing lots of pasture that is high quality. We have to have means of allocating that pasture, and I can't imagine how anybody could graze pastures without rotational grazing. So what I'm thinking you're calling paddock grazing, I call rotational grazing. I just cannot imagine how we could graze animals on pastures without rotating, because without being able to allocate feed and ration feed where it's appropriate, we just have not got control. We've got to respect residuals, and as I said before, residuals, the level of residuals are what drive adequacy of feeding. It's not what we put in front of them, it's what we leave behind them. And with pastoral grazing systems, things change. We need to constantly be refining, and why do I do that? We need to be constantly refining, and if we do it well, we can go fishing. So when we look at our grazing systems, what is pastoral grazing? It is that most of what we're feeding animals is pasture. It will always have weeds in it, and I know some farmers that I'm coming across here are sort of challenging our ability to grow high quality pastures. We can grow high quality pastures, but they will have weeds in them. That feed source will have variable growth rates, and farmers say to me, "Oh, how can you feed budget when you don't know how fast the pastures are going to grow?" We can have a darn good guess at what pastures are going to grow, and as time goes on, we can build up data sets that give us very strong data that enable us to predict what's ahead. But as long as we're monitoring, we can adjust what we can expect ahead, what is ahead. That feed resource will have a variety of, will vary in the quality, so it will vary in how much sugar is in it, according to the time of the year and the weather and particularly the time of the year and the weather and how it's being grazed. But again, we have the ability to predict quality, even though farmers think that it's a variable that we can't predict. We can. Pastoral grazing, there's a big variability in intake. And that intake is a consequence of a number of things that's going on in pastures, and one which may well impact the air as your temperatures get higher, and one that we have to cope with. In high temperatures, animals' intakes are low. No matter what we offer them in high temperatures, their intakes are low. So there's a number of factors, particularly the amount of soluble carbohydrate that in the pastures will affect the intake, the digestibility, palatability, and the toxins and the like that are on pastures will have an effect on intake. So when we look at L3 larvae, which are the worm larvae on the pastures at the infective stage, animals can detect the pasture where they are on, and given choice, they will not eat those pastures. We don't normally give them the choice. And of course, animal performance on pastures will be variable, and obviously all those intake factors will have a performance. But as I said before, when we're looking at lower than expected performance on pastures, the most common cause of lower than expected performance is they were never allocated enough. The next most common cause of lower than expected performance is that the quality of what they were offered was not good enough. If we blame trace elements, we blame the drench that we gave them didn't work, we blame a whole lot of things, but in most cases it is purely a feed issue that has not been addressed. And of course, with pastoral grazing, there's almost a suite of animal health issues which are almost peculiar to pastoral grazing. I mean, I'm sure that they are not unique to pastoral grazing, but they certainly are ones that we have to address with grazing pastures. And the biggie is internal parasites. And in New Zealand, I think New Zealand farmers are well versed with the issues around managing internal parasites, and by that I'm just talking about worms. This is my fourth trip over this part of the world, and I'm struggling to come across farmers that are well versed with the issues around the management of worms and pastoral grazing systems, yet they are a major threat. Now, our rotational grazing systems suit the accumulation of L3 larvae, because the same factors that drive pastoral growth are the same factors that drive the development, the tree-level stage development of worms on pastures. L3 larvae can accumulate. They don't mind it being cold. They don't like being hot. And we've got sustainability issues, and again, I think there's a huge level of, call it ignorance, for want of a better word, of the threat we have, because the implementers that we've relied on since 1964 are largely failing. Certainly we have a good measure of that in New Zealand, and the data that I've picked up for this part of the world suggests that risk of product failure is real in this here as well. So the world is dominated. What you use is dominated by messages coming from people that sell you those products. The world is dominated in cattle world by using porons, yet we now have such good data to show that poron drenches are nowhere near as effective as old drenches, yet they're still the most commonly sold form of antibiotic in cattle systems. And their potential to select for resistant worms is significantly higher than oral products. So if we're looking at grazing systems and managing worms within them, we have to do planning. It is about setting up a grazing plan that addresses where those worms might be and how we might minimise those impacts of that exposure. And in that plan, there'll be a plan around monitoring and planning around treatments, what to use, when we're going to use them, and what the decision process is going to be to using products.
5 minutes, Trevor.
Right. I just love this picture. That's a ryegrass blade, that's a little bubble of water, and those are L3 larvae that are in there. Those L3 larvae, their only purpose in life is to get consumed. If they don't get eaten, your life has been in vain. So they have the ability to drive that bubble of feed to increase their chances of being eaten. So on wet days they'll be up here. On dry days they'll be down here, and they can go 10 centimetres into the ground to preserve their moistness to stay alive. It's those critters there that accumulate, and it's those critters that are the big cost to productivity, because our livestock that getting exposed to those will have a reduced appetite. So the biggest response that animals have to being infected with roundworms is to reduce their appetite. Of course, and that's occurring every day, whereas we only look at worms as an issue when we've got animals that are daggy, scarring, or starting to look orphan. So managing that L3 challenge, trying to reduce the level of challenge, making useful decisions about anthelmintics, thinking of worm management in terms of a whole cycle. Since 1964, when we got thiabenzole, 99% of worm management has been by putting a chemical in to remove those deer. Yet we have the opportunity and proven opportunity to manage that threat or that challenge from internal parasites, worms, by looking at that whole cycle and intervening at other points rather than putting a chemical in. So, coming back to profitable farming systems. Profitable farming systems, nobody enterprises are making the most money. I suspect a lot of farming systems here, as they are in New Zealand, farmers don't know what is actually making the most money, so where they should be putting their focus. They don't know for sure exactly where they should be having most influence, and Michael's got a book that he keeps quoting called 400 Plus, which comes from New Zealand, which is a Bible of things to do to grow lands fast. There's probably 10 things in that book which make up 90% of the output. There's a book called 200 by 2000 that I helped put together several years ago that's been rewritten as make every mating count. And again, it's a Bible for everything to do to get a high landing percentage. There are 6 things in that book which will give high landing percentages. Most farmers aren't aware of those key points that you have to do to get the most return. That's including my farmers. I'm not saying it's specific to outside New Zealand. So having planning, a number of people today have talked about planning, and planning is the absolute key to successful pastoral grazing. Knowing what the demand is going to be and working out and providing for the supply of that feed. Doing some monitoring. Information is king. Knowing what weights are, knowing how much pasture is there are things that are easy to do and are essential. So, if we're going to increase production on pasture, and I put production there knowing that should be profit, it is planning the feed supply, planning the allocation of that feed. Doing a feed budget that says we've got this amount of feed is only one part of the equation. Planning how we're going to allocate that feed is just as important. Monitor. With pastoral grazing systems, John made the comment about how much fun it is. It is fun, being there and adjusting it and seeing the outcomes and reacting promptly. And the benefit, and coming back, having some fun is important, and living in a paradise makes that so much easier.